Patch 13.3 is upon us with some nerfs, some buffs, and some other changes too, including Aurelion Sol's rework. Our first nerf goes to Amumu with his Q costing 5 additional mana and his E is getting reduced damage early levels but increased later. Next we have Cassante, who's gaining 6 additional health per level at the cost of his Q's knockup and stun duration being drastically reduced. In addition, the stun on his W is being reduced, and when going into all-out form he now loses 85% of his resistances. Following this we have Kassadin, who's losing a lot of the early damage in his E, however when fully leveled it will be the same. Also, the cooldown reduction from nearby casts will only be 0.75 seconds of reduction. In addition, his ultimate will now deal 10 flat damage less, and the bonus stack will deal 5 flat damage less. And the final nerf goes to Zac, whose W and E will now scale less well with AP. The first buff goes to Annie, with her now spawning with her passive fully stacked. In addition, her E is stronger at early levels, and the cooldown is reduced by 2 seconds, and the retaliation damage is increased and scales better with AP. In addition, the shield also damages enemies who hit her with both attacks and spells. And Tibbers gets additional health, armor, and magic resist, scaling with Annie's AP, and his movement speed is increased at later levels. Next, we have J4, who's getting 2 additional armor, and his W now has an 8-second cooldown and scales with bonus AD. However, it will only last 4 seconds. Following this, we have Kale, who gets additional speed when exalted, and her E passive on hit damage now scales better with AP. Next, we have Kayn, whose blue form passive will now deal more damage, and his blue form's Q now scales better with AD. Following this, we have LeBlanc, who's getting additional mana regen, her Q will now cost 50 mana at all ranks, and her ultimate has a much lower cooldown at early levels. Next, we have Lee Sin, who's getting additional AD scaling on his Q, but losing a large amount of damage on his E in exchange for a greater slow later in the game. Following this, we have Trundle, who's getting a 2-second reduced cooldown on his W at all levels, and the most important thing is his dancing will now scale with his additional movement speed. Next, we have Alistair, whose passive healing will now scale with his maximum health, and his Q, W, and E all cost less mana and have greater AP scalings. Following this, we have Braum, who will now be able to apply his passive to the same target faster from earlier levels. In addition, his Q has a reduced cooldown at early levels, and his W now grants massive amounts more armor and magic resist. Next, we have Nautilus, whose passive deals more damage, the W has a reduced cooldown at early levels and grants 10 extra shield, and his E now has a greater AP scaling. Following this, we have Pike, where his E has a higher flat damage as it's leveled. Next, we have Rakan, whose Q has a 1-second faster cooldown, the mana cost is greatly reduced, and it heals for much more. In addition, his W is also getting a higher AP ratio. And finally, we have Thresh, who's getting a higher AP ratio on his Q and his E, however his W shield now only scale 1.5 per soul. We also have a full rework for Aurelion Sol, which I will have a video out on soon, but for now, his passive collects Stardust, which will buff his other abilities. His Q is a channeled ability which causes him to breathe out Starfire in a direction. While used, he roots himself, and you can move your mouse around to change the direction this is channeled. This does maximum damage to the first target hit and reduce damage to surrounding enemies. This ability can be channeled for 3.5 seconds, but when fully leveled, it can be channeled indefinitely as long as you have the mana. Aurelion Sol's W flies him in a direction, while flying his Q has no cooldown, and after getting a takedown, this ability's cooldown is reduced by 90%. His E is a skill shot which places a black hole in the floor which damages enemies and pulls them in, and his ultimate causes a massive star to crash down, stunning and damaging all enemies hit. We also have a small buff to overheal. Radiant Virtue now costs 200 more and doesn't grant you or your allies ability haste. Umbral Glaive's got a longer cooldown and ranged champions now only hit wards for 2. We get some clarity on how tenacity stacks, and jungle camps grant more experience and treats give less gold. You can ward more early game and turrets deal more damage early game.